David, and thank you to Vitrolife for the kind invitation to talk to you today. Our centre is in the northwest of England, that's where Liverpool is, and it's slightly unusual in that it's a very big women's hospital. It's the biggest women's hospital in Europe, and it is government funded, and this is where the Hewitt Fertility Centre lives. The centre is very well supported by the hospital. We are a large department within that hospital, and we're lucky to have very, very good state-of-the-art laboratories, etc. We're quite a large centre. We're doing over 2,000 cycles a year now. I need to tell you something about the way health economics works in the United Kingdom. One of the pleasures of living in the United Kingdom is that we get to pay a huge amount of tax, and that tax is paid to our government, and our Parliament decide how much of that tax is given to the Department of Health. The Department of Health then decide how much they will give to so-called clinical commissioning groups, and the clinical commissioning groups decide whether they spend their money on cancer treatment or orthopaedics or indeed IVF. The Department of Health also decide how much money to give to commissioning boards who effectively build hospitals and facilities in which we work. If you are a successful hospital in the UK, you can be granted so-called foundation trust status. Foundation trusts have been around for just over 10 years now, and they are independently regulated, so they're not directly regulated by government. And they are run by a council of governors and a board of directors, which gives them more freedom. Foundation trusts have more freedom to choose what sorts of treatments they have, and particularly to manage their own budgets. The centre, the hospital that I work in, is a foundation trust, and about 4 or 5 years ago, I was put in the unpleasant yet difficult situation of being asked if they were to give us a large amount of money to improve our assisted conception service, what would we spend it on? And that raises the question of evidence-based medicine. Everybody in the room here would agree, I'm sure, that we should be providing evidence-based medicine. That's difficult, or it was 4 or 5 years ago, in relation to time-lapse, because that information wasn't there. The information regarding the efficacy of time-lapse didn't exist. So we had to consider, in relation to the time-lapse machines, what they were good at, and why did we choose to put EmbryoScopes into our laboratory. There are some things about EmbryoScopes, I think, which are particularly good. Firstly, there was some evidence in the literature even 4 years ago. Secondly, EmbryoScopes have been around a long time. They've been 10 years in their development. They are extremely high quality products in my view. The images that you all know that you see from them are very high quality too. You can see what's going on with the embryos. They're relatively easy to use, and they're flexible. And when we questioned the EmbryoScope manufacturers, we couldn't trip them up. They seemed to have thought of everything in terms of the design. I must be honest, there were some things that we weren't quite so happy about. The first was the cost. As I'm sure you know, these are not cheap machines. The second was that in order to expand within the laboratory, that can only be done in a stepwise way. So you either have one EmbryoScope that will hold 6 patients or 2 that will hold 12, etc. They take up some space. And we were concerned in the early days that we were going to spend an awful lot of time annotating embryos. The final thing that we were slightly concerned about back 4 years ago was the EmbryoScope a finished product? Where was it going to go from there? How was it going to be taken forward? So I had to go to the hospital with a case to move forward with the EmbryoScopes, and one of the concerns that the hospital had was there a risk associated with these EmbryoScopes. and I could not see that there was any risk associated with using them. As Marcus has mentioned already, we have stable culture because we don't need to open the incubator doors. That's a given. The other thing that seemed obvious at the outset was that we were going to be getting a huge amount of information that we didn't have access to before. And you can see on this slide here, over the last 6 months or so, the numbers of embryos that have done something strange, as Marcus mentioned earlier, that we would have missed. So, for example, in the last 6 months or so, just over 200 embryos going through our lab directly cleaved from 1 cell to 3 cell. And we would have missed that before. So again, this was an obvious advantage. So our time-lapse journey began back in June 2011 when we got the first EmbryoScope. About a year after that, we got a second EmbryoScope. And at that time as well, we started to use embryo glue for all of our patients routinely. We also installed 2 EVA systems in 2012. I think as a scientist it's difficult not to sort of keep your options open a little bit, so we do have that system in our laboratory as well. And I must point out that over that time period, patients were charged to use the time-lapse system. What's interesting is that we have a proportion of private patients that go through the centre, but the same proportion of private patients and government-funded patients paid for their treatment. So in June 2013, we then made a decision that we felt the technology was good enough and it was something that we should be given to all patients. So we installed a further 4 EmbryoScopes, and then from that point on, every single patient going through the centre had access to time-lapse technology. And we then stopped charging patients for this. We needed another 2 EmbryoScopes in the beginning of 2014. And from September 2014, we started using the single-step GTL medium. And I'll come back to that in a second. We have an isolation laboratory in our centre where we treat patients with known viral infections. And in 2015, we installed a Primo Vision into that laboratory. And as business has expanded, we now have 2 more centres, one in the just south of Manchester, and one down in London, and they both have EmbryoScopes in them too now. I mentioned the isolation laboratory. We chose to put a Primo Vision system into the isolation laboratory rather than an EmbryoScope, and that was a conscious decision because the Primo Vision sits very well in an existing incubator and is relatively easy to decontaminate. And also the numbers of patients going through the isolation laboratory is much lower than the main laboratory. This is our algorithm. We, as Marcus mentioned, we've been in the fortunate position to be able to develop an algorithm based around our own data. And I think that is important to do because if we compare the published algorithms against our own algorithm in our own centre, we see this sort of picture, examining the positive predictive value of the algorithms 1 to 6, which are the published ones, against our own at the end there. You'll see that our algorithm works better. And then a similar picture for specificity and a similar picture for sensitivity. So I would encourage the development of algorithms in-house, but that does mean that you have to have a lot of embryos to do that. So has it enhanced outcome for patients? I guess that's what it's all about. These were our preliminary data, and I think you can see there that across the board, whichever age group or whichever outcome parameter we look at, things have improved using the EmbryoScopes compared to the conventional type of incubators. As I'm sure many people in the audience do, we look at our implantation rates on a monthly basis. And again, since we've installed the time-lapse machines and given it to all our patients, our implantation rates have gradually gone up and up and up. How do we compare with other centres in the UK? These data are from our regulator's website, so they are open to anybody. Obviously, I've taken the names of the clinics off the bottom, but you can see that over the same time period, we were performing reasonably well, and then the bar on the far right shows our implantation rates over very recent months, and they are significantly higher than a lot of clinics in the country. So I'm very pleased about this. One of the challenges we face in the UK is, and particularly within a government-funded setting, is the desire to have a single embryo transfer programme and to produce singleton pregnancies and not twins or triplets. We now perform just over 80% single embryo transfer, and you can see from that graph again it's something that we monitor. That's consistent now, so the vast majority of our patients are having one embryo transferred, and that is our patients' expectation now, and we can see that by looking. Our regulator makes us record every time a patient goes against our advice. So if we say to a patient, you should be having one embryo transferred, and they insist on having two, we have to record that. And so we keep what we call a non-compliance log. And you can see that the number of patients who are not behaving themselves or going against our advice has dropped, such that in 2014 there were less than 30 patients who disagreed with our advice. And that has had that effect on our multiple birth rate. The purple arrows show the government targets for multiple birth outcome, and we are now comfortably below that. And in terms of this session, I believe quite strongly that time-lapse has helped us to achieve that, because we have the stable culture, because we can select the best blastocysts, single blastocysts to transfer. And as Marcus mentioned previously, we've also seen a reduction in early pregnancy loss using EmbryoScopes. I mentioned that we now use single-step medium, and these are data from our centre where we compared over 2 different time periods accepted, but we've compared sequential G1, G2 against GTL, and we see no difference in outcome. I would draw your attention, however, to this poster, which shows that although we don't see a difference in outcome, we do see a difference in the way the embryos progress. They are quicker in the GTL medium, which is interesting. Using GTL has led to some efficiencies in our lab. If you imagine we are doing in the region of 10 egg collections per day, something like that, of which 80% are going to have blastocyst culture. That means that we are having to do 8 day 3 media changes each day. And it takes about 6 or 7 minutes for a competent embryologist to do that media change or media refresh, which equates to about an hour per day that is saved by using the single-step medium, which in a busy lab like ours, that's important. It also, of course, means you don't have to take the slides out of the EmbryoScope, so they remain undisturbed. I feel very strongly that we continue to need more high-quality research. There really has only been, as yet, one prospective randomised study showing the benefits of EmbryoScope. So we need to do more research, and the government-funded programme like ours is in a good position to do that. We've had nearly 40,000 embryos through the EmbryoScopes now, and I must acknowledge my colleague Amy Barry, who is completing a PhD now, trying to make sense of all this information that we have in our lab. I'd like to finish with some simple National Health Service mathematics. If we provide 1,000 first IVF cycles and we have a 25% live birth rate, the government will have to pay for 750 second cycles of IVF, which at about €7,000 a cycle is going to cost €5.25 million. If our live birth rate is only 5% higher than that, you can see where this is going, that represents a cost saving to the NHS of €500,000. And these are big sums of money. And the government is starting to realise this, I think, such that in Scotland now, the commissioners there have provided EmbryoScopes to all of the government-funded programmes in Scotland. So I see the benefits of time-lapse within a government-funded programme as, obviously, it provides stable culture for our embryos. You can deselect, as we've discussed. We're getting a massive amount of new information, but we still don't really know what it means, I think. It allows us to do research. We get higher pregnancy rates, and higher pregnancy rates reduce public cost. Thank you very much indeed.